Back on my question.
Ruth, are you there?
I am, yes.
Ah, here you are. I'm in full screen and you're in small screen. That's the wrong. That's better now. Thanks for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Can you hear me well?
I can, yes.
So as you can see, we are in a room that takes around 100 people. We have half the room here waiting to hear from you. We have just been discussing how the panorama of rewarding teaching is changing, maybe, and how much we look forward to see it change it more actively. And we're trying to do our stuff here, our part. We are trying to do it. So we're really looking forward to what you're gonna show to us. I really admire the report that you've written, and I'm taking it very attention to think about what we're doing here at the institution and national level. And it's wonderful that you have taken the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you. I'm really delighted to be connecting with your community as well.
Right. So while we were doing the exchange of the Zoom thing, I presented you. So I told you about your work as an independent consultant. I told you about the work that you're doing with major institutions around the world, and that you have this difference from us, that you have the view from the one who is no longer inside of the university. Maybe you want to add something about yourself.
Yes, well, I'm an academic by background in engineering before moving into educational change, and really my work is focused on helping universities to deliver pedagogical innovation, to deliver positive educational change. And what I'm talking about today is the reward and recognition system. So I've been working as a consultant and in education now for about 20 years. And I talk to a lot of academics one-to-one and anonymously. And I would say probably 9 out of 10 people that I speak to and not independently talk about the reward system as a disincentive, talk about the fact that as an academic, there's a lot of pressure for performance and impact in research, and that teaching often takes a back seat. And very often with teaching, it's about volume. How many students are you teaching rather than your impact and your progression as an educator? And it really felt to me that the reward systems were holding back change in education. And that's why I focused a lot of my work over the last 10 years on the reward systems and how universities can change and how to overcome a lot of the very serious, significant barriers and challenges to that kind of change.
Thank you for that introduction. I guess I'm going to pass the floor to you now. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you. It's lovely to connect with you all. 1 second. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be there in person, but I hope at future events and on future occasions, I will be able to be with you in person. So I'm just sharing my screen here. So what I'm talking about, as I mentioned there, is reward and recognition. Can I just check? You can see that okay and hear me okay? Great, thank you. So what I wanted to talk about actually is the change that's happening globally in how some universities are rewarding teaching. And these are research-intensive universities. It's by no means all institutions, but there's a real momentum for change amongst a growing number of universities to really radically rethink the role of teaching within academic careers and career progression. And I think it's quite an exciting change, and it's something that's particularly accelerated over the past 5 years. So what I wanted to talk about first was this Advancing Teaching Initiative. It's a group of institutions trying to make change and working together to make that change. And then I wanted to talk about this recent report on best practice, mapping what's happening globally for universities, changing their reward systems, and digging a little bit into some of the practices at those institutions. So just to first give you a context for this Advancing Teaching Initiative, It's an informal global initiative to improve effectively how teaching is rewarded in academic careers. And it's university leaders from universities across the world, but also representing governments, representing consortia of universities. And we've used a definition of what we call university teaching as a catch-all term that doesn't just mean classroom teaching, but it also incorporates other activities that are designed to improve student learning. So curriculum development, pedagogical research, student supervision, developments of policies and strategies. So we use this term university teaching to describe all of those activities related to teaching and learning at universities. So over the past 10 years, we've been working to try to help universities to improve the reward of university teaching. Everything that we do and produce is open source, so it can be used by anybody, any institution, and it can be adapted. So we produce it in a form that means that people can take some of the ideas and extract them and use those materials, so that it's not prescriptive at all, and it's designed to be a community resource. And we've really tried to respond to the challenges that universities are facing when they try to improve how teaching is rewarded in academic careers and in career progression. And the first of those questions, and this is really where we started, was the question of how can progression in university teaching be defined and be demonstrated? So in research, it's very straightforward and I think internationally understood what are the criteria for progression. It's in terms of your research impact, your publications, your grant income. Those steps in the career ladder on research are very clear, but they aren't necessarily in teaching. And the first major question really we looked at is how do we better define what career progression looks like within the teaching, within the university teaching domain. And on the basis that a lot of universities have the same kind of model in terms of how they reward university teaching in academic careers. So if you imagine this model, and I'd be interested to hear if this model resonates with you at your university. But if you look here on the horizontal axis, it's the impact in university teaching that an individual academic has as they progress. And on the vertical axis is the reward they have for that impact in university teaching, primarily through career progression, moving to the next step in the career ladder. And most of the institutions, in fact, all of the institutions that we were working with, had this kind of model at their institution for rewarding university teaching. So at the lower end of this scale, there was a threshold A, and below that, there were consequences for effectively poor teaching. So perhaps a lot of the students in their classes failed exams, perhaps they got very low scores in the student surveys. But at many institutions, those individuals that fit into that lower threshold may be denied promotion. They put in a promotion case and they're told, actually, no, you can't be promoted until you improve your student survey forms. At the other end of the spectrum, at threshold B, at many institutions, there are people who are promoted to full professorships on the basis of their exceptional contributions to teaching and learning, perhaps pedagogical research, perhaps having a sustained and profound impact in education. But often that's only 1 or 2 people a year. Between thresholds A and B, which actually in most institutions encompasses maybe 90 or 95% of academics, any incremental improvement or greater impact they have in teaching and learning has almost no effect on their career progression. And perhaps this line isn't always completely horizontal. Maybe there's a slight angle to it, but certainly this was a model that a lot of universities recognised, and a lot of university leaders said, yeah, this effectively is what's happening at my institution. But there are 2 key reasons, 2 key barriers to change. The first is as I mentioned before, the absence of clear and accepted definitions of progressive levels of teaching achievement that punctuate the stages of the career ladder. So along this axis here, what are the stages of progression? What does that impact look like when it comes to university teaching? And as well as those difficulties in defining the progression levels, is also the inadequacies of the forms of evidence used to demonstrate and evaluate that teaching. So what does an academic need to put in their application? What do university promotion committees need to evaluate in order to reward their achievement? And I think there's a lot of concern that if this is just about student evaluation scores, survey scores, can we really justify promotion through the career ladder on the basis of that alone? So those were the two key things that we looked at. And I won't go through this in detail, but we developed a framework with progressive levels of teaching achievement, these 4 levels, and underneath that, a lot of information about what evidence could be used to demonstrate impact. As I say, all this information is available in open source, so and I can circulate that, but it's all available on the website as well. So that was the first key thing that we did. And actually that framework is now being used by over 50 universities and higher education systems worldwide. They're all using it slightly differently, but they all have that same basis, that same framework. So that was the first question that we dealt with. The second question is about the change process. How can universities manage that change process? And we developed this roadmap for change. We looked at universities that had already tried to change the way they reward teaching. Some of them successfully, some of them unsuccessfully, and try to understand, for example, what are the common elements in the successful changes? What are the key steps in the process? So this was designed to help universities think about how they go through that change process. Another key question that universities asked is, how can we identify whether policy changes are having the desired effect in practice? So I think there's a lot of concerns that universities would design new career pathways, new promotion criteria, but actually nothing changes in practice. The same people are nominated for promotion, and the same people, the same types of people are being promoted, and the policies are largely ignored. So we developed a survey called the Teaching Culture Survey, and it was in 3 runs, 2019, 2022 and 2025. 28 research-led universities from across the world have taken part in the survey. We just finished the questionnaire part of the survey for the final run just last week. And we're in the process of data analysis, but it's really helping universities to understand, once you change the policies, how does that impact the culture of teaching in the institution? Do academics actually trust that their universities will deliver those changes in practice? And do they feel that if they perhaps focus a little bit more on teaching in their careers, that will be rewarded, not just now, but throughout their careers? So those findings are coming out in October, and they'll all be available on the website. But again, I can pass those on. So then the most recent question that we've been looking at is, what can we learn from best practice? A lot of academics, university leaders have talked about 2 things. One is, how can I show my institution that the rest of the world or parts of the rest of the world are really making a profound change in how they reward teaching? How can I demonstrate that? And secondly, how can I learn from best practice? How can I identify and understand what other institutions are doing in a way that can help me and my institution? So this global mapping study was launched, canvassing views of change leaders worldwide, and showcasing best practice solutions. And that's the second piece that I wanted to talk about today, was the findings from that study. So as part of that process, I interviewed 127 people from 26 countries, really trying to understand, but very much focusing on institutions that have made changes and how highly regarded they were. So the first aim was to map what's happening, to understand the change that's happening globally, and which institutions have been identified by peers as being best practice. So one question I asked everybody that was interviewed was, where do you look to for best practice? When you're looking at your own institution or your country and you're thinking about change, which institutions do you learn from, do you look to? And I pulled together all of those recommendations, and this is the top 12 institutions that are identified. A lot in Northern Europe, and then others across the world. If you can see here, Utrecht University in the Netherlands was really seen by many as a leader. And I would say Utrecht has done a huge amount in terms of thinking about what their academics need to support cultural change, but also thinking about how to incentivize and reward impact in university teaching. So here are the top 12 institutions. Obviously, many others around the world were also identified. And actually, a lot of the interviewees also talked about countries that are making change together. And it's interesting how many countries are working together. This is just a selection, I think, of the most high profile, but there are many countries worldwide where universities have joined together to, as some say, to hold hands and to make the change and to support the change in collaboration. So in Denmark, they've adopted a common definition, a common framework for the progressive levels of university teaching. And all Danish institutions are now making changes together to implement that, all in different ways, but a lot of them are using it to change their career pathways, but also their educational development programs and other things. Malaysia, this was a top-down initiative, but all Malaysian universities have been asked to implement a new set of academic career pathways by a government initiative. In Norway, another bottom-up development, developing a pedagogical merit system that supports the reward of teaching, and it sits slightly aside from the formal career pathways, but it's a financial reward for academics who excel in university teaching. And then the final one, which is probably the most ambitious, is in the Netherlands. All Dutch universities have agreed to make changes across the board, not just to how university teaching is rewarded, but to research as well. So all of the career pathways are being redesigned. For most of those institutions, the definitions of impact for those and the criteria are also being redesigned. So a massive change in the Netherlands. And I think the changes they're making there will be very influential. So that was the global mapping. And then the second piece was a global practice handbook, looking at some of those best practices to learn, and particularly to learn how those institutions have tackled challenges faced at other institutions. So looking at these 12 and the others identified, we really looked at what are the common ingredients of success? What are these institutions particularly doing, and what can we learn from them? And this is a summary, really, of the common ingredients of success. Three big buckets. The first is around the design of the career pathways. The second is about the systems that support those career pathways. So how teaching is defined, educational development, annual academic review or appraisal, all of those systems, how are they supporting reward systems? And then the third is about cultures, how to develop a culture that supports excellence and impact. And I'm just going to give you briefly a few examples of what some of those institutions are doing. So in this first piece, the design of career pathways, three elements that are really prominent in many of those highly regarded institutions. Collegiality and collaboration, really emphasizing that teaching or university teaching isn't a solo exercise. It's about collegiality and support and development as a community. The second is flexible and diverse career pathways, that you don't just go down one pathway, but that you actually have an awful lot of flexibility and you can create your own profile, that maybe you want 60% of your role to be focused on teaching and 20% on research and 20% on external impact, that you actually have the flexibility to focus on the academic domains that you're most interested in and are most expert in. And finally, clear progression routes to educational leadership. At many institutions, there's a sort of ceiling at the associate professor level for people who are more focusing on teaching and learning, and actually having a real progression route to educational leadership, what educational leadership really means, and how you can have an impact in that domain. Those institutions really focus particularly on that. I'll just give you one example. UCL in the UK redesigned their career pathways about 5 years ago, 5-6 years ago, and they have this flexibility. So there are 4 domains: teaching, research, institutional citizenship, and external impact. And the candidates have to have a threshold ability in all 4 of those, but they can then define which of those is a core ability and a specialist ability. So they really have that flexibility to design their own profile of academic. So the second piece of what success looks like is these institutional support systems. And there's an awful lot there, and the extent to which they're aligned with the career pathways. So for annual appraisals, to what extent do line managers really talk to academics about their development in university teaching? I think so often in those annual appraisals or performance reviews, there'll be a question about are you enjoying your teaching? What's the teaching load? How much teaching are you doing? What are your survey scores like? But sometimes that can be a ticked and then moving on to the main focus, which is research. So to what extent do those annual appraisals really reflect a focus on university teaching, but also a clear route to progression? To what extent does the university have a unified set of standards so academics really understand what the reward system is and what they're being rewarded for? The professional development or academic development systems that really allow continuous development that in areas that actually interest the academics. So and then the final is protecting time for educational development, innovation and leadership, that the academics are not given so much classroom teaching that they're unable to devote the educational portion of their time to development, innovation, and collaboration in education. So those institutional support systems really are hugely important. And just to give you a couple of examples, these robust and reliable processes to evaluate and assess university teaching. I mention this because so often this is the piece that universities struggle with. They perhaps have a really clear definition of these progressive progression routes in university teaching. They have a really clear set of criteria in their pathways, but actually the way that they evaluate candidates in university teaching isn't robust. So the candidate perhaps will put together a really thoughtful case for promotion that really ticks the boxes for the criteria, but the promotion committee that is reviewing that don't necessarily have the expertise to evaluate excellence and impact in university teaching. And that is a huge problem in many institutions. Those individuals are often on the committee because they are senior at the university and have progressed through research. And maybe there are 1 or 2 people who are education focused, maybe the vice president for education, maybe the head of the teaching and learning group or similar. But actually the vast majority of people on that committee aren't educational experts. And for many, a surprising number of institutions, it's that fact that's really holding back change. And it's something that's incredibly difficult to reform within the institution. Without waiting for people to retire and populating that committee with some people who perhaps have more capacity to evaluate excellence and impact in university teaching. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples of universities that are thinking differently about that impact. The first is the National University of Singapore. Now, this is just for their education-focused career pathway. So it's not for all academics, but they have a external review panel of real world experts in education who come to NUS for 2 weeks every year and evaluate independently evaluate promotion candidates on the education focus pathway. They don't just evaluate the application for promotion, they actually also interview them and observe them in the classroom. So, and they provide advice then to the promotion committee. So there's one, I think, really interesting example. And actually, the example at NUS built on something that's happening in Sweden, where they train academics to be independent external reviewers of promotion cases, of the education part of promotion cases. And another example is from Eindhoven University in the Netherlands. And at the moment, they're piloting this scheme where they also have this kind of blended career pathway where the academic can build their own profile, the percentages that they attach to different things, to education, to research, to external engagement or other. And they've said the profile of the promotion committee and the expertise in that committee has to reflect the profile of the candidate. So the example that I gave, that the candidate would be 60% focused on education, the expertise of the committee would also have to be 60% based on education. So those committees, they have 2 people who are common to all so that there's consistency, but they're re-identifying a committee based on the profile of the academic that's applying. Interesting. I mean, it's a huge amount of work for the institution because you have to rejig the promotion committee, but I think a really interesting approach in which they're piloting this academic year. And another example of continuous educational development, just very briefly, is Utrecht University in the Netherlands. They have taken an incredibly thoughtful approach to how to support development of their academics around education. So the courses above are ones for continuous development. You can identify and engage with those throughout the career, but and through identifying your particular interests. And along the bottom is the career oriented development with what they call BKO and SKO, which are the teaching qualifications, the basic teaching qualification and the senior teaching qualification. But actually thinking about how to support progression throughout that. And you'll notice in grey are the 4 stages of the career framework. So they've based that progression around the career framework that I spoke about earlier. But I think a really thoughtful approach, and they've their approach has been incredibly influential. It was interesting how many people I interviewed talked about Utrecht. And I'll just mention this senior fellow programme, which is supporting academics to move into a full professorship with partially or fully focusing around university teaching. A really thoughtful programme, a 5-year programme to support educational leadership. But again, that has been incredibly influential. And then just finally, embedding all of that in an institutional culture that champions university teaching and also prioritizes things like the visible representation of university teaching in communications and functions across the university, active collaborations between academics and specialists in the university, but also global collaborations in education and scholarship of teaching and learning. Scholarly approaches and continuous improvements in university teaching, and allowing academics to pursue individual interests, passions and pathways in university teaching, not locking academics into being one type of educator or one type of champion or innovator in pedagogy, but really allowing them to develop their own interests and passions. And I just briefly wanted to mention this on this final point at Vrije University in the Netherlands, who, again, a lot of people talked about taking a really thoughtful approach to how they design their educational development. And they've developed this series of hexagons. These are all the current educational development courses available at Vrije University. If you can see the darker colours along the middle are all the that move across horizontally. So here, 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 and here. These are all qualifications in teaching and learning, but the rest of them are different kinds of educational development experiences that are very much based on the academic's interest. And they suggest some pathways. Academics don't have to take these, but they suggest some example development pathways. So educational leader here, these are the ones that if an academic is interested in educational leadership, these are the types, these are the courses that they might wish to take as they move through the institution. So just a very thoughtful way of designing those. And that system and process is very much reflected in how they define university teaching and the design of the career pathways as well. So those are the best practices. There's a lot more in the report if anyone's interested to look at that in terms of best practices, particularly around tackling the challenges that universities face in rewarding teaching. So just the next steps for the advancing teaching group as a whole, we're busy analysing the data from the surveys at the moment, and particularly interested to look at if there's been improvement over time, over those 6 years, in terms of the perceptions and experiences of academics at universities that have changed their reward systems. And as I say, those findings will be released in late October. We've got a meeting coming up in Copenhagen of 50 of those leaders of change programs. And obviously at those institutions, there's a huge amount of change happening, and different types of change with different areas of focus, but a huge amount of change. And just to mention that the website I mentioned is advancingteaching.com, and there's a lot of material on that, including videos of what some of those institutions are doing and what some of those countries are doing in terms of making change, as well as all the reports and studies that I mentioned. So thank you very much.